The creak of the floorboard pulled me out of sleep like a hand around my throat. It was 3 in the morning, the hour when the Texas night was heaviest, and even the cattle outside barely shifted in their pens. My room smelled of old pine walls and the faint perfume of laundry soap. Ordinary details that should have been comforting, but the sound of slow boots dragging across the hallway floor turned those details into warnings. I sat up, heart pounding, when the door slammed open and the frame shuddered. David filled the doorway, his shadow swollen by the dim hall light behind him. His breath reeked of whiskey, Jack Daniels cheap and sharp, clinging to every word when he snarled my name. His hair was damp with sweat, his shirt unbuttoned, his chest heaving as though anger itself had carried him to my room. In his right hand gleamed the wooden handle of the axe, the same one he used for splitting firewood, now a weapon turned toward blood instead of logs. My body froze, though instinct screamed at me to run. Behind him stood my father Henry, calm as if this midnight raid was a routine chore. He wore his old cowboy shirt collar open, a half-burned cigar resting between 2 fingers. His eyes were not shocked, not horrified, but cold and certain a sheriff of his own cruel court. He leaned against the doorframe, watching his son step forward. My father had always been tall in his silence, but tonight, that silence was worse than any scream. David lunged toward my bed, and I felt the rough calluses of his hand close around my arm. He yanked me from the covers, dragging me to the floor, my knees slamming hard against the boards. My nightgown tore at the shoulder, my skin scraped raw. I begged him to stop, but his eyes were red swollen with drink and his grin stretched wide. He raised the axe with a guttural sound that made the air vibrate. For one suspended second, I thought he might pull back, that even in his rage there would be a flicker of humanity. Instead, the blade came down. I lifted my left hand in pure reflex, and the world cracked with a sound that will never leave me. Pain seared up my arm like fire, and I saw the impossible, my own hand separated from me, blood bursting in hot waves across the wooden floor. My scream tore the silence apart. The walls, the quilts, the very floor seemed to shudder with it. David pulled back, breathing heavy, while I collapsed against the dresser, clutching the stump with what remained of my strength. The room spun my pulse, a wild animal beating against its cage. And then my father spoke. He inhaled slowly from his cigar, exhaled a thin stream of smoke that curled toward the ceiling, and said with an eerie calmness, "Texas law is clear, girl. This ranch belongs to men, not dreamers like you." He smiled as if my pain was nothing more than an evening's entertainment, a casual reminder that in his kingdom, daughters did not matter. That smile, colder than the wound itself, carved deeper than any blade. I stumbled back, my nightgown already soaked crimson, my vision blurring. David laughed under his breath and muttered, "You will remember your place now." My father nodded once in approval, a gesture sharper than a command. I realized then that this was no accident of rage. It was a lesson planned in silence, carried out with brutal precision. I pressed my right hand against the wound, hot blood seeping between my fingers. My breath came in shallow gasps, each one coated with the taste of iron. I wanted to collapse, but something inside me screamed louder. "Run!" I shoved David with the last strength I could summon and darted past him, the wooden boards slippery beneath my feet. He swung again, the axe catching the doorframe as I bolted into the hallway. Splinters rained against my back. The ranch house at night was a labyrinth of shadows, every corner familiar but menacing. I stumbled through the kitchen, knocking over a chair that clattered against the tiled floor. The sound thundered through the silence, dogs outside, barking in response. My bare feet struck the cold linoleum, then the rough porch boards. I burst into the night, the chill air hitting my sweat-soaked skin like ice. My breath clouded in front of me, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. Behind me, I heard my father's voice, calm and steady, telling David to let me run, that I would come crawling back. That sentence struck harder than any blade. The gravel of the ranch driveway cut into my soles, each step leaving streaks of red. The stars above stretched endless across the Texas sky, but they gave no comfort. I clutched my arm tight against my body, the world around me tilting. In the distance, the silhouettes of neighbors' houses glimmered faintly, porch lights glowing like unreachable beacons. For a split second, I thought I saw a curtain move, a shadow of someone watching, but the light snapped off. Doors closed, silence reigned. The whole town had ears, yet none would open their doors against Henry Dawson. I staggered forward, lungs burning, whispering to myself the words my mother once told me when nightmares chased me as a child. When the night feels endless, run toward the light. I searched desperately and far down the road through the haze of pain. I glimpsed the faint red and blue glow of the sheriff's office sign. It flickered against the dark like a promise, like the last chance not to disappear. My legs barely obeyed me every step, a rebellion against collapse. My mind replayed the moment in the bedroom, the flash of steel, the cut of air, the cold smile of my father. It was not just the loss of flesh, it was the proof that in his eyes I had never been a daughter, only a burden to be trimmed away. Tears blurred my vision, but I kept going, teeth clenched, whispering over and over, "Not here, not tonight. I will not die in his silence." The road stretched cruelly, but the lights of the sheriff's office grew larger. My knees buckled, my shoulder scraped against the gravel, but I pushed myself up. My blood left a trail behind me, crimson against the dust. The howl of a coyote broke the silence from somewhere in the fields, a haunting reminder of how close death lingered. I focused on the neon sign ahead, the words Travis County Sheriff glowing weakly, the entrance door just beyond. Finally, I reached the steps. My body gave in at the threshold, the wood cool beneath my skin as I collapsed inside. The smell of stale coffee and paperwork filled my senses. A deputy at the desk dropped his pen, his eyes widening as he saw me fall forward, soaked in blood, gasping for breath. His voice cracked with urgency as he shouted, "Call EMS now!" My lips parted, trembling, and I forced out the only words that mattered before the darkness claimed me. "My brother." My father smiled. The room spun into nothingness. My cheek pressed against the cold floor, the fluorescent lights above blurring into pale streaks. The last thing I felt before everything went dark was the strange calm of knowing I had made it past the door, that I had carried my truth beyond the ranch, and that perhaps for the first time, silence would no longer be theirs to control. The first memory I ever kept of the Dawson Ranch was the smell of hay mixed with engine oil. Our land stretched 400 acres across the Texas plains, a patchwork of Hereford cattle fields, rusty fences, and barns that seemed to lean into the wind like tired old men. Tourists might have found it charming, but for me, it was a cage built out of dirt and tradition. Every sunrise painted the fields gold. Yet inside our home, the air was heavy with rules that never changed. My father, Henry Dawson, stood as the law of this land. People in Willow Ridge treated him like a figure carved from oak, unshakable and stern. On Sundays, he took the first pew at Willow Ridge Baptist, his wide shoulders filling the space as the pastor nodded to him before the sermon even began. Men gathered around him after service to ask about cattle prices or rainfall predictions, and women smiled politely, lowering their voices when he passed. In town, he was respected, maybe even feared, but at home, he was something colder, the architect of silence. My mother, Margaret, carried that silence like a quilt. She spoke softly, cooked faithfully, and never contradicted Henry in public or private. At supper, she was the one arranging cornbread in baskets and sliding macaroni and cheese onto plates, all while Henry praised David for fixing a fence or driving the tractor without stalling. I was expected to keep my head down to refill tea glasses, to be grateful for a seat near the kitchen door. That placement was not an accident. In our house, where you sat at the table defined your worth. David, tall and broad, always sat beside Henry. Their chairs angled close, as though they shared one mind. My chair, shoved against the wall by the swinging door, reminded me each night that I was an afterthought. It wasn't that I had no achievements. I worked harder than most. I studied at the public high school in town and later became a teacher at the elementary school, where the walls were lined with children's art and the smell of crayons clung to every hallway. My students gave me handmade cards each Christmas and sometimes a tiny plant wrapped in foil at Teacher Appreciation Week. Those moments filled me with a pride deeper than any ribbon or medal. But when I carried those gifts home, Henry glanced at them once, then dismissed them with a snort. Teaching kids ain't real work, he'd say, tilting his hat back as if that ended the discussion. Real work was ranch work, and real worth belonged only to David. David absorbed that praise like sunlight. He strutted around the ranch in boots Henry had bought him, carried the shotgun Henry had oiled for him, and spoke with the confidence of a man who believed the world owed him its ear. He called me dreamer when he was feeling generous, loser when he was not. I tried to ignore him, tried to remind myself that the classroom was my real home. But the weight of his smirk at the dinner table, or his laugh echoing in the barn, made it clear that I would never escape his shadow under my father's roof. When I was 16, I received a letter that should have changed everything. It was from a scholarship committee in Dallas. I had won first place in a statewide essay contest, and the prize was tuition coverage for a summer program that could have opened doors to colleges far from Willow Ridge. I remember running across the yard with the letter in my hand, breathless with joy. My mother's eyes softened when I showed her, but she didn't speak. Henry plucked the letter from my fingers, scanned the words, and tore it in half before my eyes. "Texas girls stay close to family," he said, his voice flat. "Don't need no fancy college." The pieces fell to the ground like feathers that had lost their wings. I stared at them, knowing in that instant that my future had been stolen not by accident, but by decree. That night I lay awake, hearing the cows lowing in the pasture, the cicadas buzzing in the trees, and my father's words ringing louder than both. I could be changed by what happened to me, but I refused to be reduced by it. I had copied that Maya Angelou quote into a notebook earlier that year, and I whispered it over and over until my tears dried. I realized then that survival in this family meant not shouting, not pleading, but remembering. I began to keep a journal in secret, scribbling down every slight, every dismissal, every time my voice was cut short. My father thought silence erased me. Instead, I was storing evidence of my existence line by line. Life at the ranch moved on repetitive as the seasons. The smell of mesquite smoke at barbecues, the clang of the old bell that called hands in from the fields, the endless Sunday services where Pastor Davis spoke of obedience and family unity while never glancing at me. I smiled when required, served cornbread when told, and kept my head lowered as neighbors asked Henry about cattle and weather. Nobody asked about me. In Willow Ridge, a daughter's value was measured by how well she supported her brother and her father. My achievements outside these walls mattered less than the dirt under David's boots. But inside, I was no longer a girl resigned to that silence. I was a woman sharpening her memory. Every time Henry dismissed my teaching as make-believe, every time David shoved me aside in the barn, I wrote it down. The notebook became my lifeline, hidden in the bottom drawer beneath old church bulletins. If discovered, it would have been called foolish scribbles. To me, it was survival. A record that proved my story was real, even when my family insisted it was not. At night, I sometimes sat by my bedroom window, staring at the faint glow of town lights in the distance. Somewhere out there, people lived without fear of being erased at their own table. Somewhere out there, women spoke and were heard. I told myself that one day I would find a way to join them. For now, I stayed bound by duty, by fear, by the invisible chains of tradition, yet holding in my chest a defiance that burned hotter each year. This was the background of my life, the stage set long before the night of the axe. A house where respect was rationed to one son, where a father's silence was heavier than his words, and where a daughter's truth was dismissed as stories. The ranch looked solid from the road fences, stretching proud and cattle grazing steady, but inside those walls the foundation was already cracked. I knew it. I felt it, and I carried that knowledge like a spark waiting for the dry season. The first time I realized that my family's cruelty was not just private, but staged for the community came at one of David's birthdays. The Dawson Ranch yard had been decorated with string lights hung from the barn rafters and long tables covered in red and white checkered cloths. Smoke curled from the barbecue pit where brisket and ribs sizzled, the smell drifting all the way to the dirt road. Neighbors arrived in dusty trucks, women carrying peach cobblers and potato salads, men slapping Henry on the back as if he were king of Willow Ridge. The evening air buzzed with laughter and country music playing low from an old radio on the porch. I carried paper plates to the tables, watching my father beam as if the party had been thrown for him as much as for David. At the center of it all stood a cake, tall frosted white with blue lettering that read, "Happy Birthday, David," in bold strokes. No mention of me. Not even a tiny acknowledgement that my birthday was just 2 weeks prior, ignored as if it had never existed. David grinned wide, leaning back in his chair while Henry raised a cold Budweiser and declared, "Here's to my son who'll run this ranch when I'm gone." The men cheered, cans lifted foam spilling onto their hands. I sat at the far end of the table, a paper cup of sweet tea in my hand, the cold liquid doing nothing to drown the sting in my chest. I tried to ease the humiliation with humor. "Guess no candle for me," I said, forcing a smile. My voice was light, but my heart trembled. Heads turned briefly, then my father's face hardened. "This night is about your brother," he snapped. A few guests chuckled awkwardly and turned away, unwilling to cross him. David smirked, leaning closer to the friend beside him to whisper something that drew another round of laughter. Heat rose in my cheeks, spreading across my skin like fire. I stared down at my plate, unable to swallow a single bite of barbecue, every laugh around me echoing louder in my ears. That night, when the last guests had gone and the tables were cleared, I slipped to my room and pulled out my notebook. I wrote about the cake, about the toast, about my father's words slicing through the evening air. My hand shook as I pressed the pen against the page, but I knew if I didn't record it tomorrow, they would pretend it had never happened. My father would say I was exaggerating, David would call me dramatic, and my mother would tell me not to stir trouble. The journal was the only place I could prove to myself that I wasn't inventing this pain. The humiliations never stopped at home. They followed me to church every Sunday. The Baptist church in Willow Ridge was small, its white clapboard siding peeling its steeple, crooked but proud. The sanctuary smelled of hymnals and furniture polish. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows that depicted scenes of shepherds and lambs, but I often felt like an invisible ghost drifting through the pews. When we arrived, Henry walked tall at the front with David beside him. Pastor Davis always greeted them loudly. "Good to see you, Henry, and this must be your fine son." His eyes never strayed to me. Congregants shook David's hand, clapped him on the back, and whispered, "What a fine young man he was." I trailed behind, clutching my Bible close, arranging hymn books on the pew as if that were my role. One Sunday, I overheard a woman near the choir loft whisper, "That Dawson boy will run the ranch well." Her friend nodded, adding, "His sister never did amount to much." Their voices were not cruel, just casual like the weather. I bit my lip, my chest tightening. I wanted to stand and shout that I was more than their shadows, that I was a teacher shaping young minds. But the weight of my father's glare across the pew kept me silent. After service, Henry lingered with the pastor while I stood by the door unnoticed as children ran past me laughing. Even in ordinary moments, humiliation seeped in. At family dinners with neighbors invited, I was ordered to serve cornbread to fetch more iced tea to scrape plates before sitting down. When I finally sat, conversation shifted seamlessly back to David. My father boasted about him fixing a tractor engine, about his strength in the fields, about how he had the grit to lead. He never once mentioned that I had closed a reading gap for struggling students, or that one of my pupils had won a spelling bee because of my coaching. My accomplishments dissolved like sugar in water, invisible. One evening, Aunt Carol, one of the few relatives who ever asked about me, turned to me at a reunion and said kindly, "How's life treating you, Clara? Are you still teaching in town?" I lit up, grateful for the attention. "Yes," I said quickly. "I've been leading a new project. It's challenging, but I think it could open doors." Before I could finish, my father cut me off with a laugh sharp as a whip. "Don't take her too seriously, Carol. She's always had her nose in cheap novels dreaming up stories." Nervous laughter rippled around the table, guests shifting in their chairs. I tried to protest, voice trembling. "It's real work, Dad. It matters." He shook his head, grin widening. "Clara has always been good at telling tales. Don't confuse that with reality." The laughter returned stronger this time, sealing my humiliation. That night, the sting was unbearable. It wasn't just dismissal, it was gaslighting in public. My father was telling the community that my truth was fiction, and they nodded along complicit. I walked out of the house, the night air cool against my burning face, and sat on the porch steps. Cicadas hummed in the fields, and distant headlights swept across the road. I whispered to myself the words of Martin Luther King Jr. I had copied into my notebook years earlier, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Injustice was not just in what was said to me. It was in the laughter that followed. Flashbacks came uninvited. I was 17 again, standing in the high school hallway. David had one arm around his buddy, the other pointing at me as he shouted, "This is my loser sister. Don't expect much." The laughter of classmates' erupted faces I saw every day contorted with amusement at my expense. I froze, books clutched to my chest, unable to respond. Through the glass doors, I saw Henry's truck idling outside. For a moment, I thought he would step in, defend me, show me I mattered. Instead, I watched him nod with quiet pride, lips curving upward. Approval, not protection. That memory branded itself into me a permanent scar. Years later, the same pattern replayed at every gathering. Family reunions meant jokes at my expense. Church picnics meant introductions that left me unnamed. Barbecues meant toasts that celebrated David while I fetched more beans. Each scene hammered the same message: you are invisible. You do not belong. Yet I kept writing. Page after page filled with dates, words, gestures. Each entry a reminder that I was not imagining this system of erasure. By the time I turned 27, humiliation was no longer a surprise. It was a script rehearsed and polished, performed for the community with everyone complicit. My father played the proud patriarch, my brother the chosen heir, my mother the silent wife, and me the shadow servant. But deep down, I knew shadows shift when light changes. I told myself that someday the light would fall differently, that the script would break. Until then, I carried my notebook like armor, silent but unyielding, waiting for the day when silence would no longer be theirs to control. The humiliations that paraded in public were sharp enough, but the cruelties inside our home cut even deeper. If my father's weapon was silence and dismissal, David's was force. At 27, I had built a life in the town school, my students bringing me cards covered in glitter, their small hands pressing mine with gratitude. During Teacher Appreciation Week that spring, one boy shyly handed me a handmade card, drawn with crayons, a simple apple, and the words, "Best Teacher, Miss Dawson." My heart swelled, tears burning the back of my eyes. For a fleeting moment, I felt seen, valued, even loved. But when I brought that card home and placed it on the counter, David snatched it up with a sneer. "What is this trash?" He waved it like it was worthless paper, then dropped it back down. "Dad was right. You do make up stories. Nobody outside this family takes you seriously." My father, sitting at the head of the table with his evening coffee, chuckled and added, "She's always been dramatic. Don't put stock in it." My mother shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Her eyes lowered as she spooned cornbread onto David's plate. The words sank deeper than I wanted to admit, not because they were true, but because they carried the weight of authority. In our household, repetition of a lie was enough to make it fact. Work on the ranch was handed to me like punishment, while David's chores were praised as training for his inheritance. Henry ordered me to herd cattle in the midday sun, my shirt sticking to my back, dust choking my throat. When I struggled with the stubborn gate on the western pasture, David leaned against a fence post, arms crossed, grinned smug, watching me fumble. "You'll never handle this place, Clara. Might as well leave it to the men." My hands blistered from the rope skin tearing beneath the gloves, but Henry only muttered, "This is ranch life." No excuses. He never noticed how often my fingers trembled when I reached for a water pail, or how I winced when lifting bales of hay. One evening, the barbed wire fence snapped while I was trying to tighten it alone. The wire whipped back, slicing across my palm. Blood welled instantly, dripping onto the dry soil. I bit back a cry, wrapping my bandana tightly around it. David sauntered over, smirk painted on his face, and said, "You're clumsy as ever. Dad says that's why you'll never run anything." His voice was filled with delight, as if my injury was proof of his superiority. Henry arrived minutes later, his eyes scanning the cut, then dismissing it with a shake of his head. "Ranch work toughens you up. Don't whine." That night, trying to wash the dirt from the wound in the kitchen sink, I saw my reflection in the window glass. The face staring back at me looked older than 27, drained, tired, but beneath the exhaustion flickered something harder. Resentment was no longer a passing emotion. It was a steady flame. I thought back often to high school when David's insults first became public sport. At 17, he cornered me in the hallway with his football buddies at his side. "This is my loser sister," he announced, and the laughter that erupted still echoes in my memory. Faces of classmates who had once borrowed my notes or asked for homework help turned cold, mocking. My father waited in his truck outside engine, idling, watching through the windshield. For a second, my heart lifted, believing he would storm in and defend me. Instead, he nodded once, a quiet sign of approval. That silent nod has haunted me longer than any bruise. Now, years later, the same pattern replayed. David insulted me at every turn. Henry endorsed it, and Margaret smoothed over the rough edges with biscuits and sweet tea as if food could erase the wound. To the community, David was the heir, the strong one. To me, he was a storm I had no shelter from. I began to dread evenings when he came home drunk. The smell of Bud Light or Jack Daniels in the air signaled danger. He staggered through the hallways, banging on doors, mocking my voice, calling me dreamer in a tone dripping with poison. More than once he shoved me against the barn wall when I dared to challenge his authority. The bruises faded, but the memory of his grin while doing it did not. My students never knew. I kept my sleeves rolled down, my smile fixed, my lessons on multiplication steady. The children deserved stability, and I gave it to them. But once I returned home, stability shattered. Henry's words repeated. "She makes up stories. Don't take her serious." The community heard it often enough that when I walked into the feed store or the diner on Main Street, I could feel the skepticism in people's eyes. That reputation crafted by my father spread like dust across town. I was no longer Clara the teacher. I was Clara the storyteller. Clara the dramatic one, Clara who couldn't be trusted. Inside, though, I knew I could not afford to let despair win. I continued to fill my notebook, every entry another piece of proof. The day David mocked my teacher's card. The night Henry ordered me to mend fences alone. The humiliation of being called clumsy while blood ran from my palm. Each line was a strike against the narrative they forced on me. Each word an act of defiance. Still, the physical toll was undeniable. My hands were calloused nails, split knuckles bruised from carrying feed buckets. Once I twisted my ankle stepping into a gopher hole while chasing stray cattle. I limped for weeks, but when I asked for rest, Henry's reply was, "Ranch doesn't stop for weak bones." My body carried scars hidden under sleeves and jeans, but my spirit carried scars no clothing could hide. And every scar deepened the certainty that this ranch was not a home, but a prison. At night, I often replayed the sound of laughter at the high school hallway, at the birthday table, at the church picnic. Each time, David smirking Henry, nodding Margaret silent. Silence was the loudest sound in our house. It wrapped around me, suffocating, yet it also taught me something vital. Silence could be a weapon. If used against me, it erased me. But if I held it carefully, it could sharpen me. I learned not to protest every insult, not to cry out at every shove. Instead, I listened, I memorized. I stored every word like ammunition. One day, I whispered to myself as I iced my swollen palm after another day at the fence, "One day, they'll see." The burdens were invisible to outsiders. To neighbors driving by the Dawson Ranch, looked prosperous. Cattle grazed peacefully, fences stood tall, and Henry waved from the porch like a man at ease. No one saw the bruises, the humiliation, the endless labor poured from me. The burden of silence weighed heavier than hay bales, heavier than barbed wire. It pressed down day and night, shaping me into someone who looked obedient but carried a storm beneath her ribs. And still, I endured. Because endurance was survival, and survival was the only rebellion left to me. I told myself every day that the notebook mattered, that my students' smiles mattered, that one day truth would matter more than silence. I clung to those thoughts as if they were lifelines, because without them, the weight of this hidden burden would have crushed me long before the night when David stormed into my room with the axe. The night the threat first turned into something I could not laugh away began quietly, the kind of stillness only rural Texas knows. The cicadas had gone silent, the cattle lowing faintly from the pasture, the ranch house creaking with its usual groans. I stepped out of the bathroom, the steam still clinging to my skin, my hair damp against my neck. The hallway was dim, the lone bulb flickering above the stairwell. For a moment, I thought the house was asleep. Then, David's shadow peeled itself from the wall. He blocked the path with his broad shoulders, the smell of beer heavy in the air. His shirt was stained, his boots muddy, his breath sour with Bud Light and the edge of whiskey. I froze towel clutched against me, heart thudding against my ribs. "Move, David," I whispered, trying to step past. He slammed his palm flat against the wall beside my head, caging me in. His grin stretched cruel and wide. "You think you're smarter than me, dreamer?" His voice was thick slurred but steady enough to carry menace. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice not to tremble. "Just let me by." His hand shot out, fingers wrapping around my throat, pressing me back against the wall. My lungs seized, panic flaring as spots danced before my eyes. The wood behind me groaned under the force. "You'll never escape, Clara!" He hissed, his face inches from mine. Eyes, bloodshot pupils small and hard. "Dad owns the sheriff. No one will believe you." The words cut sharper than his grip. For years, I had clung to the idea that maybe, just maybe, if I told the right person, someone in authority would step in. Now, hearing his conviction, I realized how deeply my father's influence ran. David squeezed harder, and for a terrifying moment the hallway spun. My breath strangled. I clawed at his wrist nails, digging into his skin, but his grip did not falter. Then footsteps echoed at the far end of the hall. My father appeared, a silhouette framed in the doorway, his face unreadable in the dim light. He stopped, hands in his pockets, watching. My eyes pleaded with him, desperate for any sign of intervention. Henry's gaze was cold, detached, and after a pause that stretched into eternity, he turned his head slightly, as if to acknowledge the scene but not condemn it. His silence was louder than David's threats. My father's eyes told me what his mouth did not. This violence was sanctioned. David finally released me, shoving me so hard I stumbled into my bedroom doorframe. My throat burned, my voice hoarse as I gasped for air. He leaned in close, his whisper hot in my ear. "Remember this. You're nothing without us." His boots thudded down the hall as he walked away, humming a tune under his breath like he had just finished a chore. My father lingered a moment longer, his silhouette steady. Then, he too walked away, leaving me shaking in the darkness. I collapsed onto my bed, clutching my neck, tears streaming uncontrollably. The bruises would bloom by morning, dark rings hidden beneath a high collar. I sat for hours, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the fear to ease. It didn't. What came instead was rage, steady and quiet, the kind that settled into bones. I pulled open my desk drawer, retrieved my leather notebook, and wrote until my hand cramped. I wrote about the smell of his beer, the sound of the wood groaning, the cold silence of my father's stare. My words trembled on the page, but they were real. I wrote one sentence over and over. Silence is his deadliest weapon. The next morning at breakfast, my throat still sore, I wore a scarf despite the heat. My mother glanced at me once, her lips parting, as if to ask, but then she looked at my father and thought better of it. She buttered biscuits in silence. Henry sipped his coffee, David devoured bacon with a smirk. Neither spoke of the night before. Their silence was a pact, a rewriting of history in real time. At school that day, a fellow teacher asked if I was feeling unwell. I forced a smile, blamed allergies, and went back to teaching long division. But inside, the weight of David's words pressed heavier. "Dad owns the sheriff. No one will believe you." That refrain echoed in my head with every chalk stroke against the blackboard, every child's laughter during recess. It wasn't just a threat. It was a reminder of the system I lived under, where silence ruled and truth was dismissed. Weeks passed, but the threat lingered in the corners of every night. David's boots stomping on the porch after midnight sent shivers down my spine. The slam of a door made me flinch. Henry's steady approval of his son's every move only reinforced the message. Once, after I corrected David about leaving the barn unlocked, he shoved me so hard I hit the hay bales, dust filling my mouth. Dad, leaning on the fence, nodded at him. "Good lesson, son." That nod carried more weight than any fist. I learned to hide bruises to mask fear with composure to measure every word I spoke. But I also learned to sharpen my silence. I stopped wasting breath on pleading. Instead, I observed, recorded, and waited. I knew storms always broke even the fiercest Texas thunderheads. I told myself my day would come. One night, as cicadas sang outside and the house groaned with the settling of beams, I reread the words I had written. Silence is his deadliest weapon. I added another line, but silence can also be my shield. In that moment, I began to believe that survival was not just endurance. It was preparation. The hallway where David had pressed his hand against my throat still smelled faintly of sweat and whiskey when I walked past it. Each time I passed, my chest tightened, but I forced myself not to avert my eyes. I looked at that spot and reminded myself I survived. His threat was real, his grip was cruel, but I survived. That survival carried power, even if quiet for now. The first climax of my story was not the axe at 3 a.m, but this night, the night when the mask slipped entirely. David had shown me his weapon. Henry had revealed his allegiance, and I thought trembling had begun to recognize my own power in remembering. I would never forget that whisper in my ear, the promise that I was nothing without them, because one day I would prove him wrong in front of everyone who had ever laughed at my silence. The night of the axe came heavy with heat. The kind of Texas summer heat that clings to skin even after the sun has gone down. Crickets buzzed in the fields, and the old clock in the hallway ticked louder than usual, each second dragging like a chain. I lay in bed with my journal tucked under my pillow, the faint smell of cedar from the old dresser mixing with the sweat dampening my sheets. My body was exhausted from another day of hauling buckets and checking fences, but my mind refused to rest. Every creak in the house, every thump of boots on the porch made me tense. When the first crash came, I thought it was thunder rolling in, but the sky was clear stars shining hard and bright through the window. The second crash jolted me upright, the unmistakable sound of wood splintering. My door burst inward with a crack, pieces of the frame scattering across the floor. David stood there, his chest heaving, the sour smell of whiskey rolling off him in waves. His shirt was unbuttoned, his eyes bloodshot, and in his hands was the axe, its blade catching the moonlight that spilled into the room. "Get up!" he roared, voice thick, the sound bouncing off the walls. My heart leapt into my throat. I pressed back against the headboard, my breath short, my hands trembling as if my body already knew what was coming. Behind him in the hallway stood my father. Henry leaned against the frame, a cigar glowing faintly between his fingers, the smoke curling lazily upward. His face was calm, almost bored, as if this were a late-night chore, not a nightmare. David stormed forward, the boards groaning under his boots. He grabbed me by the wrist, yanking me from the bed so hard my shoulder screamed. I cried out, begging him to stop, but my words vanished into the night air, swallowed by the silence of the house. My father watched, eyes, sharp lips curled into something between a smirk and a smile. David raised the axe. For a second it hung in the air, suspended, the blade gleaming. I lifted my left hand in a reflex I did not think, only acted. The strike landed with a crack that split the world in two. Pain shot through me so violently I thought lightning had struck. My vision blurred as I saw my own hand separate, blood gushing hot and fast, soaking my nightgown, splattering across the pine walls. My scream tore the night apart, high and raw, the kind of sound that carried far beyond the ranch fences. I stumbled back, clutching the stump blood pulsing between my fingers. The room spun, but David's grin widened, sweat dripping down his face as if this was triumph. "You'll remember your place now," he spat. My father took a long drag from his cigar, exhaled, and muttered, "She finally learns her place." His words were colder than the axe blade itself. Terror fueled me. I lunged for the quilt, pressing it tight against the wound, my breath ragged tears blinding me. I staggered toward the door, but David swung again, the blade biting into the doorframe, splinters flying into my hair. "Run!" my mind screamed. "Run!" My bare feet hit the hallway, slipping in the blood trailing behind me. I pushed past my father, who stepped aside, watching with the same detached smirk, as if my desperate escape were part of his plan all along. I flew down the stairs, each step jarring pain through my body. The living room smelled faintly of smoke from the fireplace, the family Bible still sitting untouched on the coffee table, an object that mocked me with its hollow sermons. The front door felt a mile away. I yanked it open and stumbled into the night. The Texas air hit me like ice, my lungs seizing as I gulped it in. Gravel cut into my feet with every step, but I didn't stop. Behind me, the house glowed faintly, shadows moving in the windows. Dogs barked from their chains, straining their howls, mixing with the throb of my heartbeat. My nightgown clung to me heavy with blood, the quilt slipping from my grip as I ran. The ranch that had always been my prison now became a battlefield, every fence post and mesquite tree a witness to my flight. I reached the dirt road, the stones tearing at my skin, each step leaving crimson smears. My vision blurred, my body tilting, but I forced myself forward. Somewhere in the distance, I saw the faint glow of the sheriff's office sign, red and blue neon, flickering like salvation. If I could reach it, if I could just collapse inside, maybe someone would finally hear me. But the memory of my father's smile followed me sharper than the wound itself. His indifference branded deeper than any scar. I heard his words echoing, "This ranch belongs to men, not dreamers like you." Each repetition made my legs burn harder, my chest scream louder. I whispered back through clenched teeth, "You will not erase me. Not tonight." The road stretched endless, the horizon swallowing me. Porch lights flicked on as I stumbled past neighboring houses, shadows moving behind curtains. I screamed once, raw and desperate, but the blinds snapped shut. No one came. Their silence was its own cruelty. Each closed door, another reminder of how deep my father's reach extended. The sheriff's office grew closer. My steps faltered, knees buckling, but I pushed myself up, crawling for a few feet before standing again. My blood smeared the road, marking the path of survival. Coyotes howled from the fields, a haunting chorus that matched the pounding in my skull. My breath came shallow, ragged, every inhale scraping my chest. I whispered my mother's old words. When the night feels endless, run toward the light. Finally, the glow of the office sign filled my vision. The glass door loomed ahead. I stumbled against it, shoving it open with the last of my strength. The fluorescent lights inside blinded me, the smell of coffee and old paper wrapping around me. A deputy at the desk shot to his feet, his pen clattering. His eyes widened as he saw me collapse forward, covered in blood, clutching the torn remains of my arm. "Ma'am," he shouted, voice cracking. "Sit down. What happened?" The room spun, voices overlapping. My throat worked, words breaking free in a whisper. "My brother," my father smiled. Then the darkness swallowed me whole. The last thing I remembered was the sound of boots rushing, the clatter of a phone knocked off the hook, and a young voice shouting, "Call EMS now." That was the night the silence broke. Not because they believed me yet, but because my blood had carried the truth to their doorstep. The sheriff's office in Willow Ridge sat at the edge of Main Street, a squat brick building with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign that read Travis County Sheriff. For most of my life, I had driven past it without a second thought, a place where speeding tickets were written and drunks were hauled in on Friday nights. That night, it became the only beacon in a landscape that had turned hostile. My body carried me forward more by instinct than by strength. When the glass door swung open under my weight, the lobby fell into chaos. Two deputies scrambled from their desks, one knocking over his coffee, the brown liquid spreading across paperwork. Their eyes widened as they took in the sight of me, a woman in a torn nightgown, face pale, blood soaking the fabric. One arm pressed desperately against a towel that had long since turned red. I staggered once, twice, then collapsed onto the tile. The cold floor shocked my skin, and for a second, I thought I might never rise again. "Ma'am, stay with us," one deputy barked, kneeling beside me. His voice was firm, but I heard the crack of fear beneath it. Another shouted toward the back, "Get EMS now!" The words echoed through the office, bouncing against the cinder block walls. The smell of antiseptic gun oil and burnt coffee mixed in the air, anchoring me to reality. I tried to speak, my throat raw, each word a battle. "My brother," I rasped. "My father," he smiled. The deputy's face hardened as he leaned closer, trying to catch every syllable. "Who did this to you?" His eyes searched mine, but before I could finish, darkness tugged at the edges of my vision. My body trembled violently, the world narrowing to the rhythm of my shallow breaths. Paramedics burst through the doors, minutes later their gurney rattling across the floor. I felt the sting of a needle in my arm, the press of hands against my wound, the snap of gloves as voices overlapped above me. Blood pressure dropping, move fast. A flashlight cut across my eyes too bright, but I could not muster the strength to flinch. I caught a fragment of a voice, female, steady and calm. "Stay with me, honey. You're safe now. Safe." The word felt foreign, fragile, yet it wrapped around me like a thread pulling me back from the edge. They lifted me onto the stretcher, the straps tightening across my chest. The ceiling lights streaked overhead as they pushed me through the lobby and out into the night. The ambulance waited its siren already wailing. The sound sliced through the quiet streets, bouncing off storefronts, rattling windows. I thought of the neighbors who had pulled their curtains shut as I ran past. Now they could not ignore the noise. The whole town would know something had happened at the Dawson Ranch. Inside the ambulance, the air reeked of antiseptic and metal. Oxygen hissed as a mask was pressed to my face. "Stay calm, breathe," the medic instructed. I tried, but every inhale burned, every exhale rattled. My body shook uncontrollably, the pain, a tidal wave cresting over me. The medic's voice cut through. "We've got a partial amputation. Stabilize vitals." I heard the words as if from a distance, a clinical description of my nightmare. The ride blurred, punctuated by bursts of consciousness. Sirens wailing, lights flashing red and blue through narrow windows. A hand squeezing mine firm and steady. My own voice whispering, "Don't let me die." The medic answered without hesitation. "Not on my watch." When the ambulance screeched to a halt, I was wheeled through sliding doors into Willow Ridge Community Hospital, a small building that smelled of bleach and stale air. Nurses rushed to meet us, their shoes squeaking against linoleum. Orders flew like arrows. "Trauma Bay 2. Get Dr. McAllister now." I glimpsed fluorescent lights overhead, heard the beep of machines, the rattle of metal trays. As they worked, I drifted in and out. I remembered my father's face, calm and smug as David swung the axe. I remembered the neighbor's blinds snapping shut, and I remembered the sheriff's office floor slick with my blood. Each image twisted inside me, carving itself deep. Even half-conscious, I knew one thing with certainty: silence would not erase this night. Hours later, I woke in a hospital bed, the sterile sheets tucked tightly around me. My left arm was swathed in thick bandages, the weight heavy, the pain dulled by medication, but still present. Machines beeped steadily, their rhythm a reminder that I was alive. The room was dim, only the glow from the hallway spilling in through the cracked door. Sheriff Coleman entered quietly, his boots heavy on the tile. He was a broad man in his 50s, face weathered by years of Texas sun, his badge glinting under the light. He pulled a chair beside my bed hat in his hands. "Clara," he said softly. I nodded weakly, my throat dry. He looked at the bandages, then back at me, his eyes troubled. "I need to know what happened." My lips trembled, but the words came steady. "David." He swung the axe. My father watched. He smiled. Coleman's jaw tightened, the lines on his face deepening. "You're telling me Henry Dawson let this happen?" He didn't stop it. I forced myself to meet his gaze. He approved of it. Those words hung between us heavy as stone. Coleman sighed, rubbing his temples. "Henry has long arms in this county. But we'll get the truth. Do you have anything, any proof?" I thought of my journal hidden under my pillow at the ranch. Then I remembered Evelyn Carter, my neighbor, who sometimes sat on her porch late into the night with her glass of sweet tea. She had seen things, heard things. Maybe she had heard me scream. My heart pounded at the thought. Evelyn, she might know. The sheriff nodded, standing slowly. "Rest now. We'll talk more tomorrow." He left the room, his boots echoing down the hall. I stared at the ceiling, the hum of machines filling the silence. My hand was gone, but I was alive. And being alive meant I still had a voice. That night, as the hospital settled into its midnight stillness, I replayed the moments leading up to my collapse at the police station. The gravel cutting into my feet, the neon sign flickering, the deputy's frantic shout, the paramedic's steady grip. Each detail stitched itself into me a tapestry of pain and survival. For the first time, I felt the faint stirrings of power. My father's silence could not erase the sound of sirens. David's fists could not undo the stain of blood on Main Street. The town had seen me now, broken but undeniable. Morning brought a new wave of questions, a new round of pain, but also a glimmer of something else, hope. I whispered it aloud, testing the sound. Hope. It felt strange, but it was real. And as I drifted back to sleep, I knew one truth above all: the night of the axe had not ended me. It had begun something they could never control. The first days in Willow Ridge Community Hospital blurred together a rhythm of IV drips, beeping monitors, and nurses checking my vitals. Each morning I woke to the antiseptic smell of bleach and faint coffee drifting from the break room. Every time I opened my eyes, the reality hit again: my left hand was gone. The bandages were thick, the ache constant, and when I shifted in bed, the weight of loss pressed down heavier than the pain itself. Yet in that sterile little hospital room, something else stirred alongside grief, the beginning of resolve. Sheriff Coleman came by daily. His voice was steady, but I could sense the caution beneath it. Henry Dawson was not just another rancher in Travis County. He chaired committees at the Baptist church, sponsored the annual rodeo, and loaned his equipment to neighbors when they needed help. His reputation was stitched tightly into the community. To accuse him was to shake the very ground people in Willow Ridge stood on. Coleman knew it. I knew it, but the blood on my nightgown, the missing hand, and the scar across my throat demanded the truth. One morning, Coleman set his hat on the chair beside my bed and asked, "Do you have any proof, Clara?" Anything that can stand in a courtroom when Henry and David deny every word. I swallowed hard, the dryness in my throat making it painful to speak. "My journal," I whispered. "I wrote everything down. It's hidden under my pillow at the ranch." Coleman nodded slowly. "We'll get it, but we'll need more." That afternoon, Evelyn Carter arrived. She stood awkwardly at the door, her sweet tea habit replaced by a styrofoam cup of hospital coffee. Evelyn was 54, a widow who had lived across the road for decades. She had watched me grow up, seen me ride my bike down the dusty lane, and waved from her porch when I walked home from school. Now her eyes were clouded with guilt. "I should have called sooner," she said quietly. I heard the screams that night. I recorded it on my phone, but I didn't know what to do. Her hands shook as she passed a small USB drive to Sheriff Coleman. He plugged it into his laptop right there in the hospital room. The sound filled the air, my voice screaming the crash of wood. David's roar, and then, clear as a bell, my father's chuckle. That single sound froze the room. Evelyn covered her mouth, tears spilling over. Coleman's face tightened, his jaw like stone. "That's enough," he muttered, snapping the laptop shut. For the first time, I saw something in his eyes beyond caution. I saw determination. The investigation moved quickly after that. Deputies searched the Dawson Ranch. They found the splintered door, the blood-stained quilt discarded on the porch, the axe with my blood still drying along the blade. Margaret Dawson sat on the porch during the search, her face, pale lips pressed tight. She did not look at me when I was wheeled out to point at the evidence. She only murmured, "This family needs peace, not more trouble." I wanted to scream at her, to ask how silence could ever bring peace, but the words caught in my throat. News traveled fast in small towns. By the next Sunday, whispers rippled through the Baptist church. Men who once shook Henry's hand with pride now glanced at him warily. Women who once praised David's strength murmured behind hymn books. Pastor Davis cleared his throat at the pulpit, shifting uneasily before beginning his sermon. The words of forgiveness and grace floated through the sanctuary, but no one missed the tension in the air. Silence that had once protected Henry now turned brittle. The first hearing was held at the Travis County Courthouse, a building with tall windows and varnished benches that smelled faintly of dust and polish. I sat in the front row, my arm still bandaged, my body weak, but my resolve sharp. Evelyn sat beside me, clutching her purse like a lifeline. Across the room, Henry wore his best suit, his silver hair combed neatly, his expression calm, almost regal. David, shackled at the wrists, glared at me with the same venom I had known since childhood. The prosecutor rose, laying out the charges. David Dawson indicted for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon under Texas Penal Code 22.02. Henry Dawson charged with complicity and fraudulent transfer of property, including the attempt to sign the Dawson Ranch over solely to his son. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Neighbors shifted in their seats, church members leaned forward, and whispers filled the air. Then came the evidence. The audio recording from Evelyn's porch played over the speakers. The crash, my screams, David's threats, and then the unmistakable laugh of Henry Dawson. The room froze. I closed my eyes, hearing it again, the sound that had haunted me. When I opened them, I saw faces in the gallery change, shock, disbelief, and then anger. My father's mask cracked for the first time. His jaw tightened, his eyes darted. He could no longer dismiss it as my imagination. The community had heard it too. When the judge asked if I wished to testify, I stood. My knees trembled, but my voice was steady. They told me silence was my place, I said, lifting my bandaged arm for all to see. But silence nearly killed me. Every dismissal, every laugh at my expense, every bruise hidden under sleeves was meant to erase me. That night, they didn't just take my hand. They tried to take my life. My voice broke, but I pressed on. Yet here I stand, and I will not be erased. The judge's gavel struck once sharp as thunder. This is not protection. This is abuse. This is fraud. The words echoed through the room, reverberating in my chest. For years, I had begged for help, whispered for someone to believe me, only to be met with silence. Now, silence turned against them. The trial stretched on for weeks. Witnesses came forward, former ranch hands who spoke of Henry's harshness, townsfolk who recalled David's drunken rages, even a teacher from my childhood who admitted he had seen the bruises but had been too afraid to say anything then. Their testimonies piled up like stones, building a wall of truth that Henry and David could not climb. Each day I sat in the courtroom, my notebook on my lap, the same one I had carried for years. Page after page of memories, insults, threats, all written in my hand. The defense tried to call it exaggeration, imagination, the scribblings of a dramatic girl. But then Evelyn's recording would play again, the laugh echoing undeniable. No lawyer could erase that sound. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered. The Austin American-Statesman sent a journalist to their cameras capturing my face as I walked up the steps. Questions flew. Clara, do you believe justice will be served? What do you want to say to your father? I paused once, turning toward the microphones. They told me silence would protect me, I said. But silence only chained me. Today, I break it. The article that ran the next morning was front page in the local section, Teacher Survives Axe Attack Family Patriarch and Son Face Trial. My photograph showed me standing tall, prosthetic fitting, scheduled my expression weary but defiant. For the first time, the town of Willow Ridge spoke my name not with dismissal, but with recognition. At night, back in the hospital, I read letters that began to arrive from strangers, women who had survived their own family's cruelty, men who admitted they had once looked away when neighbors suffered. Each letter was another stitch in the fabric of truth proof that my story reached beyond the ranch fences. The legal process was long filled with motions, cross-examinations, and attempts to delay. Henry hired the best attorney money could buy, but each time the recording played, each time my journal was entered into evidence, the cracks widened. David grew restless, his anger spilling out in court, muttering under his breath until the judge silenced him. Henry tried to maintain dignity, but the community's eyes on him were no longer reverent. They were condemning. When I finally returned to the Baptist church, months after the attack, the sanctuary felt different. I sat not at the back, but near the front. Heads turned, whispers fluttered. Some eyes were ashamed, others sympathetic. Pastor Davis's voice wavered as he spoke of truth and light, his sermon a thin veil over the reality everyone knew. My father, once the man who led prayers with booming confidence, now sat in silence, flanked by deputies. His silence no longer commanded respect. It reeked of guilt. By the time the trial drew to a close, I no longer trembled when I took the stand. I looked at the jury and spoke plainly. They told me I was nothing. They told me silence was my place, but silence became my weapon. And now, silence convicts them. The jury deliberated less than a day. When they returned, the foreman's voice was clear. Guilty. David Dawson, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. Henry Dawson, complicity and fraud. Margaret sat in the gallery, her face wet with tears, but still she said nothing. The judge's gavel fell again. Sentences will be handed down in the next hearing. The Dawson name, once the pride of Willow Ridge, crumbled in front of everyone. As I stepped out of the courthouse that day, reporters swarmed. Cameras flashed. I held my bandaged arm high, the stump covered in clean white cloth. They wanted a soundbite, something for headlines. My voice was calm. They took my hand, but not my voice. The words rippled through the crowd, carried into microphones written in ink. For the first time, my truth was louder than their silence. The verdict struck harder than any axe. For years, the Dawson name had been a shield in Willow Ridge, polished by Sunday church attendants' generous donations to the rodeo fund and the image of a hardworking ranching family. But once the gavel dropped, that shield cracked into pieces. What followed was not just the punishment of two men. It was the unraveling of a dynasty built on silence and intimidation. David was taken straight from the courtroom in shackles. His eyes burned with hatred, but his swagger was gone. The deputies kept a firm hand on his shoulders as he cursed under his breath. People in the gallery who once laughed at his jokes now leaned away from him as if he carried a contagious sickness. The charge of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon meant he would face years behind bars under Texas law, and everyone knew it. His fists, once a tool of unchecked power, were now restrained by steel cuffs. Henry remained stoic as ever, his face carved into a mask. But his silence no longer commanded respect. Instead, it read as arrogance, denial, and weakness all at once. The charge of complicity and fraud cut deep. Evidence had surfaced of shady paperwork filed at the county clerk's office deeds that attempted to transfer ownership of the entire Dawson Ranch to David alone, cutting me out completely. Those documents, signed in Henry's precise handwriting, were displayed in court like relics of betrayal. For decades, Henry preached about honesty at the Baptist church, about responsibility and stewardship. Now the congregation whispered about lies and theft. The first to crumble was the community's reverence. At the Baptist church that Sunday, Henry's usual place in the front pew sat empty. Pastor Davis mentioned him only in passing, his voice tight. When prayers were lifted for healing and guidance, not a single person spoke Henry's name aloud. Instead, I felt eyes on me. Women who once avoided me offered hesitant smiles. Men tipped their hats. The silence that used to erase me was slowly turning into recognition. At the ranch, the collapse was physical. Deputies sealed the property with bright yellow tape. Neighbors driving by slowed their trucks to stare. The sight of cattle grazing behind fences now marked with county seizure notices was a spectacle no one could ignore. Rumors spread that the state might auction off the land to pay for legal fees and restitution. For a family that once bragged about 400 acres of prime Texas pasture, the humiliation was unbearable. Margaret Dawson, my mother, walked through town with her head down. At the grocery store, women whispered behind shelves of canned beans. She had spent her life protecting the image of Harmony, serving cornbread with a smile, even as her children were divided into golden son and unwanted daughter. Now people muttered, "She knew, she saw." She stayed quiet. The same silence she once used as armor became a brand of guilt. I watched her shoulders hunch lower with each passing week. She never defended me, but neither did she stand beside Henry in public anymore. She drifted in limbo, caught between shame and loyalty. The community paper, the Willow Ridge Chronicle, published an editorial titled "The End of a Legacy." It described the Dawson family as a cautionary tale, what happens when power goes unchecked and silence is used as currency. Reading my own family name in that headline was like swallowing glass. Yet it was also vindication. For years, people acted as though my experiences were figments of imagination. Now the truth was printed in black and white for every household to read over breakfast. At school, colleagues approached me differently. Some admitted they had heard the rumors long before, but hadn't known whether to believe them. A few confessed they stayed quiet because Henry was too powerful, too respected. Their regret stung, but it was better than silence. My students, too young to understand the details, hugged me fiercely when I returned. One little girl pressed a drawing into my palm, a picture of me standing tall, holding a book in one hand, the other replaced by a shining star. I cried quietly in the teacher's lounge, clutching that picture like it was scripture. Meanwhile, Henry's allies dwindled. Men who once sat with him at the diner stopped inviting him to the table. The feed store clerk who used to greet him with a laugh now kept conversations short. At the rodeo grounds, people whispered that the Dawsons had poisoned their own name. Respect in small towns is like cattle fencing. Once a post breaks, the whole line falls. The financial collapse followed the social one. With legal fees mounting, the ranch was placed under court-ordered seizure. The herds were sold off piece by piece, Hereford cattle loaded into trailers bound for other counties. Auction flyers appeared on the bulletin board outside the post office, Dawson Ranch equipment for sale. The shiny tractors and hay balers, once symbols of Henry's success, now became bargains for neighbors. Watching men bid on those tools was like watching vultures circle. Yet I felt no pity. Those machines had been weapons of control too, reminders that I was expected to serve without recognition. As the Dawson empire crumbled, my own strength grew. I walked through town with my prosthetic fitting in progress, bandages still visible. People stopped me to say they were sorry, that they admired my courage. Some voices were genuine, others tinged with guilt. Either way, the weight of silence shifted. The town that once erased me now could not ignore me. Still, the collapse of my family was not easy to bear. At night, I lay awake in my small apartment, the memories replaying. David's grin as the axe fell, Henry's chuckle in the hallway, my mother's silence at the breakfast table. The collapse of the ranch did not erase the scars. It only proved that lies have limits. Margaret visited me once during this time. She came quietly knocking on the door of my apartment with a Tupperware of homemade peach cobbler. She looked smaller than I remembered, her hair thinner, her voice uncertain. I wanted to ask her why she never stopped it, why she never spoke, why she let my blood soak the floor without protest. Instead, I accepted the cobbler, set it on the counter, and listened as she whispered. I didn't know what to do. It was the closest thing to an apology she could manage. But I knew better. Doing nothing was a choice. Her silence had been a decision, not an accident. The day the ranch auction was finalized, I drove past the property one last time. The fences leaned, the house windows were boarded, and the fields were quiet. The land that had been my prison was now just dirt and grass, stripped of the power it once held. For the first time, I looked at it without fear. It no longer owned me. David's sentencing came first. The courtroom was packed. The prosecutor outlined the brutality of the attack, the lifelong impact of losing a hand, the cruelty of a man who laughed while his sister bled. The judge's voice was steady as he delivered the sentence: years in state prison. David shouted curses as deputies dragged him away, his voice breaking into echoes that carried no power. Henry's sentencing followed. The judge spoke firmly, condemning his role in enabling violence and defrauding his own family. Henry's face remained stone, but his shoulders sagged slightly when the words landed. Complicity, fraud, prison. His name, once synonymous with honor, was now carved into shame. When I walked out of the courthouse that day, the air felt lighter. Reporters crowded close, cameras flashing. I paused at the top of the steps, my prosthetic arm covered by a long sleeve. They wanted a statement, something that captured the collapse of the Dawson empire. My voice was calm but steady. They built their power on silence. But silence does not last forever. The story ran across Texas, from the Austin American-Statesman to smaller county weeklies. Neighbors who once doubted me now had no choice but to see. The collapse of the Dawson legacy was no longer a whisper. It was a public truth carved into legal records and newspaper ink. For me, the collapse was not just their downfall. It was my liberation. Each brick that fell from their empire freed me from a weight I had carried since childhood. The family name that once erased me no longer had the power to do so. In its place stood my own voice, sharp, undeniable, and finally heard. The courthouse steps were hot under my shoes, the Texas sun glaring off the white stone as if even the sky wanted to mark the moment. Reporters leaned forward, microphones thrust out, their questions overlapping. For years, my voice had been dismissed inside the walls of my family's ranch, but now the world seemed to wait for me to speak. I straightened my back, the sleeve of my blouse covering the new prosthetic that replaced my hand, and said clearly, "They took my hand, but not my voice." The words carried across the square over the hum of cameras and into the ears of neighbors who once turned their backs. For the first time, I felt my voice weigh more than my father's silence. The days after the sentencing felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, breathing air I had never known before. Freedom was not soft at first. It was sharp, almost frightening. The absence of control of Henry's watchful eyes or David's heavy boots left me trembling in ways I did not expect. Trauma clung to me like Texas humidity, heavy and unrelenting. But beneath the fear grew something sturdier resolve. Physical healing came slowly. My first visits to the Texas Orthopedic Clinic in Austin were grueling. The waiting room buzzed with veterans, accident survivors, and others whose lives had been reshaped by violence or misfortune. I sat among them, bandages still visible, my journal balanced on my lap. When the prosthetic specialist fitted me with a trial device, the weight startled me. It felt foreign, mechanical, nothing like the hand I had lost. Yet, as I lifted it, flexing the fingers one by one, I felt a spark of possibility. "This is not the end," I whispered to myself. "This is the beginning of another way to move forward." Therapy was another battlefield. At the community hospital, the physical therapist guided me through painful stretches, teaching my body to trust balance again, to hold a pencil, to steady a coffee mug. Some days I cried in frustration when the simplest tasks, buttoning a shirt, tying a shoe, felt impossible. Yet each small success stitched resilience into me. When I managed to write my name clearly with the prosthetic for the first time, I pressed the page against my chest and breathed deep. My father had once tried to erase my name from the ranch papers. Now, even with a new hand, I claimed it back in ink. Emotional healing was harder. Nights brought dreams of the axe of my father's cold chuckle of neighbors shutting blinds as I stumbled past. I woke in sweats, the sound of boots echoing in my ears. A counselor at the hospital helped me work through the memories. She reminded me trauma doesn't vanish, but it can be carried differently. Her words gave me permission to stop blaming myself for every bruise, every silence. Slowly, I began to believe that what happened was not my shame to hold. Community reactions shifted in ways I never imagined. At the Baptist church, women who once ignored me now left casseroles at my door. Some of it was guilt, I knew, but some was genuine compassion. Pastor Davis approached me one Sunday, his voice low, his face etched with regret. "We should have spoken sooner," he admitted. I looked him in the eye and said, "Silence is also a choice." He nodded, unable to argue. Evelyn Carter became my closest ally. She visited often, sitting on my porch with her ever-present glass of sweet tea, her presence steady and warm. We talked for hours about her late husband, about her regrets, about the courage it had taken to finally hand over that recording. Evelyn never claimed she saved me. She simply said, "We save each other when we decide not to look away." Her words became the foundation of something larger than the two of us. The collapse of the ranch was finalized when the auction sold off the last of the Dawson equipment. I drove past the property one last time, the fences sagging, the house empty. For years, I thought leaving that land would feel like exile. Instead, it felt like release. The ranch had been a stage for my erasure. Without it, Henry's power withered. My power, however, grew. That was when I decided to start the Silent No More Foundation. It began in a small rented office near the elementary school where I still taught. The sign was modest, the furniture secondhand, but the mission was clear: to provide a place where women could come with their stories of abuse to be heard without dismissal, to be offered resources and legal guidance. Sheriff Coleman supported it, promising referrals and protection where he could. Evelyn became the first volunteer, greeting women with sweet tea and a listening ear. The first survivor who walked through the door was a young mother with a bruised cheek clutching her toddler. Her voice trembled as she explained her husband told her no one would believe her. I reached across the desk, showing her the prosthetic hand, and said, "They told me the same, but we are not erased." She cried, and for the first time I felt my suffering transformed into something larger than myself. My pain became a bridge for someone else's hope. News of the foundation spread. Reporters returned not to ask about the Dawsons, but to highlight the work being done. The Austin American-Statesman ran another story this time with a photo of me holding a book in one hand while the prosthetic rested gently on the shoulder of a young girl who had come to the foundation with her mother. The caption read, "From Silence to Strength." Seeing that in print made my chest swell with something I had not known in years' pride. Yet healing was not only public, it was also deeply private. In the quiet of my apartment, I reread my old journals. The pages were stained with tears, the handwriting uneven from shaking hands, but they told the truth of my survival. I began compiling them into a manuscript, not for revenge but for testimony. Each line was proof that silence had never truly conquered me. When a publisher in Dallas eventually agreed to release the book, I titled it The Sound of Silence Breaking. Holding the first copy in my hands was as powerful as any courtroom victory. The town of Willow Ridge slowly redefined me. Where once I was the overlooked daughter of Henry Dawson, now I was the teacher who survived the woman who spoke. My students began calling me Miss D, their hugs fierce, their laughter a balm. Parents thanked me quietly at pickup, some admitting my story had pushed them to leave their own harmful homes. The ripple spread farther than I imagined. As for my family, the collapse was permanent. David remained in prison, his letters filled with venom I refused to read. Henry's health declined behind bars, his name reduced to whispers of shame. Margaret visited once more, older, thinner, her eyes hollow. She said she prayed for me every night. I listened politely, but I no longer hungered for her approval. My healing was not tied to her silence or her prayers. It was mine alone. The Baptist church, once a place of humiliation, became a stage for reclamation. One Sunday, invited by Pastor Davis, I stood at the pulpit. My prosthetic hand held the Bible my mother once carried. I read aloud from Isaiah, "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you." The congregation listened in silence, not dismissive, not mocking, but reverent. For the first time, my voice filled the sanctuary without fear. Years later, when the Silent No More Foundation expanded to Austin, I walked into the new office with Evelyn by my side. The walls were lined with shelves of donated books, the waiting room filled with toys for children. A plaque hung near the entrance, in honor of Clara Dawson, who turned silence into strength. My throat tightened as I read it, realizing that the legacy of my family's cruelty had been replaced with one of resilience. Healing did not erase the scars. I still woke some nights hearing the echo of my father's chuckle, still felt the phantom ache of the hand I lost. But healing gave those scars meaning. They were not symbols of defeat. They were reminders of survival proof that even in the darkest nightlight could be chosen. On the anniversary of the attack, I returned to the courthouse steps. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in bruised gold and purple. I stood quietly. No reporters this time, only Evelyn and a few friends from the foundation. I whispered the words I had once scribbled in a notebook as a frightened girl. Silence is his deadliest weapon. Then I added the truth I had earned. But silence, when broken, is stronger than any weapon. We walked away together, laughter rising softly into the evening air. My life was no longer bound to the Dawson Ranch, to Henry's silence, or David's fists. My life belonged to me and to every woman who needed proof that survival was possible. Freedom was not land or inheritance. Freedom was truth spoken aloud, carried forward, and shared. I lifted my prosthetic hand toward the horizon, the metal fingers catching the last light of day, and felt the warmth spread through me. Revenge had never been fists or fire. Revenge was truth so loud it shattered lies, and freedom, I finally understood, was never given. It was claimed. When I finally stepped away from the courthouse for the last time, I knew my story had reached its conclusion, at least in the eyes of the law. But in truth, stories like mine never end. They echo in the lives of others, in the silence of homes where fists still fall and voices still go unheard. That is why I am here today, not only to share what happened to me, but to reach out to you, the ones listening, watching, remembering. If you have stayed with me through this journey, you already know that silence is never neutral. In Willow Ridge, silence was a weapon used to keep me small, to erase my name from the story of my own family. My father's cold smile, my brother's rage, my mother's quiet compliance. They all relied on silence to keep the truth hidden. But silence can also be broken. and when it breaks, it has the power to shatter walls stronger than barbed wire. For those of you watching who are over 50, who may have lived through decades of family secrets, of church whispers, of closed doors, I want to speak to you directly. I know what it means to grow up in a time when you didn't question your parents, when you didn't talk about what happened behind closed doors, when the family name mattered more than the individual soul. But I also know that many of you carry stories like mine inside you, locked away, weighing on your hearts. Maybe you were told to keep quiet for the sake of appearances. Maybe you still hear voices telling you to bury the truth. I want you to know this. It is never too late to speak. Your voice still matters. Your truth is still yours to claim. Think about it. If a daughter in small-town Texas could drag herself barefoot down a gravel road at 3 a.m, bleeding half-conscious, determined to reach a police station where she might finally be seen, then so can you. You can pick up the phone. You can tell your story. You can write it down, even if only for yourself. Because every word spoken against silence is an act of resistance. And let me tell you something I have learned through pain and healing. Revenge is not fists. It is not fire. It is not hate. True revenge is living free, speaking the truth so loudly that those who tried to erase you can never escape the echo. If you are watching this and thinking, that sounds like me, or that was my sister, my friend, my neighbor, I ask you to take one step. Leave a comment below. Share your experience. Say, I understand. Say, I survived. Or simply say, I'm listening. You never know who else might read your words and feel less alone. Community is built not by keeping secrets, but by sharing truth. On this channel, every story we tell is another crack in the wall of silence. Every click, every share, every comment is proof that the days of being erased are over. I know many of you watching are parents and grandparents. Think of the younger generation, the daughters and granddaughters who look to you for strength. What do we teach them if we remain silent when they are hurt? What legacy do we leave if we pretend nothing happened? I stand here as living proof that breaking the silence is not only survival, it is legacy. So I ask you, if you found yourself holding your breath during this story, if you felt anger rising at Henry's cold smile, or grief at David's violence, or sorrow at Margaret's silence, let that emotion move you to action. Hit the subscribe button so you won't miss the next story. Like this video if you believe voices like mine deserve to be heard. Share it with someone you know who needs to see that survival is possible, that justice can happen, that silence does not have to win. And before you click away, I have one more request. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. This channel is building a community across states, across generations, across oceans. I want to know your town, your city, your small place in the world. Because when we connect those dots, when we realize how many of us are out there listening, the silence breaks a little more. To my neighbors over 50 especially, I invite you to speak. Maybe you've carried decades of silence about your father's temper, your husband's cruelty, your family's favoritism. Maybe you've been told your story doesn't matter anymore because too much time has passed. Don't believe that. Time doesn't erase truth. If anything, it sharpens it. And every time one of us speaks, another person finds courage to do the same. When I stood in the Baptist church after the trial holding the Bible with my prosthetic hand, I felt something I never thought I'd feel in that space. Peace. Not because my scars had vanished, but because my story had been heard. That is the gift I want to give you now. Let your story be heard here with us. Because freedom is not in the land we inherit, or the money or the family names carved into courthouse walls. Freedom is in the truth we speak, in the community we build, in the courage to claim our own lives. I am Clara Dawson, and this is my story. They thought they could take my hand and my voice, but I am still here. And now, so are you. Stay with me on this channel. More stories are coming, stories that will shake you, anger, you break your heart, and then mend it again. Stories of survival, of resistance, of justice finally being served. If you believe in those stories, if you want to stand with us as we break silence together, subscribe now. And do not forget to comment below. I read every single one. Together, we are stronger than silence.